Our cities are disgusting. Just realizing I said okay after Vaush said I love you. Yeah, sorry, Liz. You were so starstruck you didn't even know how to respond. Not my fault. All right. Oh, Socialism Done Left. I think I recognize that name. Hey, Socialism Done Left.
I can hear you now. Can you
Howdy.
hear me?
Thanks for the research doc.
For the really big, stinky right-winger fact sheet.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Do you crib shit from
cribbed.
that?
Huh?
Yeah. I knew it. I fucking knew it.
Yeah, for sure. What's up?
That's the whole point. I guess a while ago I had wanted to talk to you either about whether the United States was a democracy or about like gun control and leftism.
Whatever you prefer. One topic.
Sure, why don't we do the gun control one? So
Sure.
the basic take that I have is that there is fundamentally no argument in favor of gun ownership. It doesn't help self-defense. Revolution's never going to happen in the modern state against the modern armies, and it doesn't seem to empower people to protect their freedoms. So then all the bad things it causes, suicide, homicide, and so on, mean that you shouldn't want guns, ideally. Now, it'd be hard to achieve that in the United States.
More like socialism dumb cringe, am I right? Am I right, chat? Chat, am I right? Chat?
You really nailed that one, my dude.
Thank you. Been doing this for a little while. I'm starting to get good at those zingers.
Really, do you have a big channel?
Yeah, it's growing. Yeah, so, okay. I'm not under the impression that the general ownership of guns meaningfully adds to the safety of the life of the average American. There are a couple of reasons why I defend the ownership of guns. First of all, from a philosophical level, I am and always will be in favor of the idea that by some metric, the general population should be able to commit a revolution if they want to. Now, not getting into any TOS material here, obviously the combined forces of the United States military would be capable of annihilating any armed insurrection from any number of people, obviously. And there's nothing we could ever do about it. However, the issue is revolutions are very rarely the military versus the population. The military itself is an organization that often has sympathies with the people. They are, in many cases, proletariat, or proletariat sympathizing. And I am of the opinion that much in the same way that our occupation of places like Afghanistan or Vietnam were made much more difficult through the general guerrilla tactics and ownership of firearms in those regions. Likewise, we do insulate ourselves somewhat against tyranny by owning guns. Because America isn't going to just nuke Seattle. It won't just nuke
Probably
Seattle.
Not.
If a crackdown happens, it'll be people in the streets. It'll be convoys and soldiers moving through.
Yeah, unmarked vans taking protesters.
Unmarked vans taking exactly. Things that can be resisted with firearms. Unless they can send in tanks. There are civilian responses to tanks. Not much so to drones, but drones are expensive and they can only be managed for so long and in such great a number. Ultimately, I think it's not enough to lead a revolution, but what it is a stopgap, a dissuasion, a fuck around and find out, if you will.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, I've rambled for quite a while. Go.
Sure. So the basic take that I would give, so there's this really interesting book on the subject of resistance by, I think it's Chenoweth and Stefan, 2001. I can get the title real quick.
Yes, Chenoweth and Stefan.
Chenoweth and Stefan, 2011, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict. So they attempt to create this big data set of all the resistances to tyranny. So you have stuff like the Tiananmen Square, the dissolution of the USSR, and on and on and on. It's not just socialist countries. It's virtually every example they can find. And what they found is that nonviolent resistance was about 4 times more likely to succeed than violent resistance. And in particular, even when you do like a big multivariate regression and you control for violent crackdown of the state, nonviolent resistance was still preferable to violent resistance. So I guess my fear actually is that ownership of guns might lead people to resist those like unmarked vans. And then it seems like, hey, those unmarked vans are actually pretty justified. These protesters they're killing people, they're looting, they're car bombing, they're the IRA. Well, I guess we can justify killing them too. So my concern is
Yeah,
actually that guns might
that's definitely a
yeah.
valid concern. Here's my extra secret follow-up double meme.
Oh no.
What if advocacy for gun rights ends up being a wedge issue that can pull people from the right over to the left to engage in whatever kind of protest they're interested in? And therefore, the support of guns, at least here in America, is just valid as an optics game to try to maximize the potential pool of people who then could eventually do nonviolent protests.
So I think that one's interesting, but if we want to go down that route, like there's a million policy positions you could potentially see the left advocating for that would probably be more effective. Like if you want to look at, you could do the whole meme of like red brown alliances, right? Maybe the left should take Bernie Sanders' stance and be like a little bit hesitant about immigration. Surely that would appeal to the slightly racist, maybe even a little bit more than slightly racist white blue collar workers in like the Rust Belt. So I think just that saying like, hey, this policy is good optics is not sufficient to mean that we should advocate for it. I think that like if you look at the vast majority of studies, guns lead to an enormous increase in the amount of like homicide and violence in the United States. And I would much rather take like a 0.5% loss of the voting population.
I think there are ways to address that without removing guns.
Sure, somewhat. It's just that generally we see that like as countries tend to reduce their amount of guns, tend to increase their regulation, then they do better. I agree. Like regulation can solve some of it, but
not regulation. I mean an elimination of the drug war, the elimination of the NRA, a reduction in the prevalence of common gun culture, that sort of thing.
Those ones would almost certainly help solve the homicide part of it, but they actually wouldn't solve the suicide part, which is about 2/3 of the deaths from firearms.
Well, we could just solve that with trying to address the factors that cause people to kill themselves, no?
I mean, kind of yes and no, right? Like the take that I would give is that generally suicide rates are higher in countries that aren't the United States because the main drivers of why people kill themselves seem to be related. Like fundamentally, religion is a really big one. As Americans are going to increasingly abandon religion, suicide rate's going to go up. But more generally, even in substantially better healthcare systems, it's not sufficient to reduce the suicide rate to anything comparable to the United States. So I don't think that this is what this actually works. I guess I'd need to look into like what is the efficacy of say like free or subsidized psychological care on reduction of suicide.
How do you feel about gun armories, sort of in a communal sense, like neighborhood armories that are sort of managed locally, where you can get guns if you want them for hunting or for violent uprising, but you don't keep them in your house? Keeping a gun in your house doesn't really do anything good for people, for the most part.
That's the kind of argument I'm most amenable to, right? You'd have like your gun ranges, your like centralized armory, and you go and check out a gun like you would from the library, and you return it in 2 weeks. You get a late fee. I think that's most likely to solve the suicide problems, most likely to solve the homicide problems. But then it's honestly just a question of unnecessary expense, right? Like, why do it at all? What are you going to need them for? If you're going to try the popular uprising, you're just going to get shot. Even if you shoot back, more of you are going to die.
No, I think that things are a little bit more complicated than that. The so my answer to this would hinge largely on the methodology of the studies that find that nonviolent resistance is 4 times as likely as violent resistance. There are also a lot of confounding factors there, like maybe revolutions that are more likely to succeed never feel a need to reduce themselves to violent resistance, whereas revolutions or protests that had like a strong electoral base to begin with could stay nonviolent because things never got tested to that point. There are a lot of really complicated. Yeah, and then you have to consider like, what about factors that don't necessarily express themselves for the purposes of the data? What if the fact that citizens have firearms has kept the U.S. from doing way worse shit in the past? You know, what if the fact that most that there are more guns in America than there are people has prevented the United States from doing other things they might have felt comfortable doing if they were trying to otherwise avoid a conflict or some large media spectacle surrounding armed resistance? I'm not disagreeing with your premise here necessarily. I'm just saying I would need to see the methodology before I felt comfortable adjusting my rhetoric or positions, you know?
Sure. Well, if you have a few hours to read it. Chenoweth Stefan's book's only 250 pages, right? Got
Is it
at least
normal
like
to
3
be
or 4
able to read
drafts.
250 pages in a couple of hours?
Well, just put your nose in it. Just fucking tunnel vision in on it, okay?
Is that an anti-Semitic remark?
Oh my god. Probably not.
All right. I'm not Jewish.
Like idiom.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the I will say. So I know I'm taking a bit
quickly,
of the
because
time.
we have to move
Yeah.
forward.
So as a closer, right? I do think Chenoweth and Stefan's book is very interesting. One of the things they do note is actually there's an interplay between the violence of the movement and how many people are drawn to the movement. One of the things that you mentioned is like, hey, maybe large movements don't need to resort to violence. One of the things that seems to also be the case is that more violent movements have a harder time getting people into them in the first place. So it's somewhat of it's not clear which way the causality goes, and it probably goes both ways. That if you're a violent movement, you can't get people to join, so you can't get big, so you need to stay violent. And so it's like a repeating cycle, and vice versa on the other side. So I guess my reading recommendation to everyone, Chenoweth and Stefan, 2011, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Resistance. Thanks for having me on.
Email it to me. I'm not going to remember anything that we've said by the end of this 12-hour stream, okay? Email it to me. I'll take a look, and I'll see how I feel. There are still some... just philosophically, the idea of us having literally no recourse against... our oppressors is not one that sits well with me. Though, I guess, the idea, Marx, under no pretext should the proletariat surrender their arms, kind of relied on two things. One, the state of gun culture 150 years ago, which is not the state of gun culture we have today. Anyone should be able to acknowledge that. If a lefty can't acknowledge that, then they're delusional. And B, that at the time when Marx was saying that, the general possession of firearms was a more reasonable way of resisting the imposition of power from a tyrannical state or from tyrannical corporations. Whereas nowadays, if it could be found that there are other systems which did a better job of accomplishing the same goal, I feel Marx would probably... It's not about the guns. It's about the thing the guns do and how well they do it. But again, so I'm not an ideologue on this. Move me over, send me the email, okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Opinions on the average citizen keeping an Abrams tank in their garage. I think that would make us a fairly decent, combatant versus the United States government.
If only we had recreational nukes, finally we could stand up against the oppressive U.S. military.
Unironically. Sadish John, are you here? You know what I'm talking about. Hey, buddy, I love you. Thank you for talking.
Mashallah. Have a nice evening.
What does mashallah mean? Is that a Muslim thing? Muslim saying? Okay. He called me ugly. He called me ugly. Yikes. Well, we know who's still pro-gun after this stream, boys. All right, let's do it.